Hey everybody, welcome back to the Generative Edge. My name is Brandon and I'm here with my two co-hosts today, Vyas from AWS and Donovan from Deloitte.
Hey.
Today we're going to be talking about demystifying generative AI for the C-suite. So Vyas, in the past couple of weeks we've been having some conversations. I know that you had this really good analogy of how generative AI is somehow related to this position we were in when we discovered radio technology. Do you want to maybe start with that actually, because I thought it was really pertinent.
Totally, and I'm glad you still remember that conversation. So this is something which I heard as well, and it stuck to me. In 1939, I think I got my year right, that was the first time when the television broadcasting started. And I was surprised to know the first scene which was actually broadcasted was a radio presenter talking the news, because that is all they could think about, right? So here's something which we broadcast. It used to be radio before, and now we have something which is visual, and why not broadcast someone actually reading the same radio? And they loved it. It continued for a while. But now you see how the whole television broadcasting has evolved. And I think we are at that inflection point for generative AI as well, because we are just thinking about what are the things which we can do now, can be done better using generative AI. But I think the future is a lot more, which we haven't even thought about the possibilities. And that's where we are.
How do we move from recording people in their garage to Game of Thrones?
Absolutely.
Of generative AI.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a scary and exciting place to be, I can imagine. I mean, just thinking about some of the things we've been seeing, and if I can be a little bit provocative and under this topic of demystifying Gen AI
here
for the C-suite, do our executive level business stakeholders understand Gen AI and the outworkings of Gen AI? And should they really care? Thoughts? Ideas?
It's a very loaded question.
Not to say that there aren't that do.
So here's the statistics I have. So every 7th minute when I'm in an executive conversation, the word generative AI is spoken about. So everyone knows about what generative AI is. But the potential of what it can do for their respective business, do anyone understands yet? I would say we're still in the nascent stages. I wouldn't say they won't. It's just that I think the art of possible is a lot more than we all can imagine at this point in time. So the question is not necessarily should someone really know the underpinnings of how generative AI works, but it's about understanding where exactly they can use it to, in fact, do 3 outcomes, right? How do I save money? How do I make more money? Or how can I actually transform my customers' experience? I think this is the thought process which I see the customers are thinking, not necessarily what happens in the underpinnings. But for an organization, it's important, right? So you need to know really what happens underneath. But for C-suite, I think that's what I'm looking at right now.
Obviously, in an ideal world, I would love for all C-suite people to know what Gen AI is.
Talking like a true specialist, right?
Yeah.
On the receiving end of the use case. Yeah.
I'm on the receiving end of all the use cases and the technical implementation stuff. So in an ideal world, yeah, they would know. But maybe it's more important that they know the limitations rather than how it works, just like what you can and cannot do. Say it again.
Are there limitations?
For sure. There's limitations to any technology, right?
Should they be limited? Should they be thinking about a limitation, or should they be pushing the bounds of their thinking, rather looking at the problems they need to solve right now, forgetting about the limitations and allowing the underlying technology leaders to be worried about those?
I think the space for experimentation is really important. So I think that every company should be experimenting with new things. They should be communicating what their use cases are and collaborating in that way. There's plenty of places to play and experiment and find out what the limits are. But of course, then there are other limits that are just theoretical limits, right? Like you can't, build a rocket ship with a text model or something. So it's these kinds of things where like the limits are pretty much there, and you just need to make sure that they're communicated effectively. And then the other ones, which are maybe less clear, like how accurately can I extract information? How accurately can I summarize news articles or something like that? That's more in the realm of experimentation. So that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I'm just thinking hard. I mean, is it the word limitation? I don't think it's more limitation. It's probably our understanding of what it can do, because sometimes when you're given a new tool, you don't know what to do with it, right? And because you don't know what to do with it, does it mean that you cannot use it? The answer is no. I think we are at that stage. I think like Spider-Man said, with power comes responsibility, right? So I think this is very similar to that. I think it gives you a huge power, and there is always deciding of what is the right thing to do and what's not. And I think we are at that stage right now, Donovan. But I think for me, the opportunity is immense. Like I said, this is a step shift in technology. The internet revolution is one of the things. Graphical user face, that's another example which I typically use, right? So now you're talking about multimodal. I mean, if I ask my kids that I used to use a CRT-based user interface with only keyboards, they laugh at me because today anything without touch is something they just cannot use it. They are native users of those. I think the next generation would be, we don't want a screen, right? So it's multimodal interface. And what generative AI helps you do is build something like that. Yeah. Do we really understand what that is right now? Maybe not. So that's why we might think it's more our limitations in the thought process. But I think, like I said, the possibility is immense. I think that's what everyone should be thinking about right now.
Yeah.
Are we going towards augmented reality on the podcast today?
well, maybe next time. Yeah. Although I was thinking of throwing a pair of goggles onto my 5-year-old as he runs around shouting at Alexa and touching my TV screen, thinking everything's a touch screen these days. I often think about what the world will be like in 10 years when he's in school. And yeah. Anyway, Brennan, I wanted to ask you a question. Okay. Because you and I work relatively closely together. And I know that you're
saying we don't.
Closer. And I see this quite a bit in and amongst the teams. Everything's generative AI, as you said. Every 6 minutes in conversations, we're talking about generative AI. When some of those use cases land into POCs, production, we find that while it gets dropped as a generative AI use case, we see 85% of that workload being software, automation, maybe even general or generic AI. Like, what are you seeing? What do you sense? Does that ring true to what you've seen?
Definitely. So generative AI in and of itself is somewhat revolutionary in that it just changes the kind of data that you work with in these systems, but it's not revolutionary in the way that we build them out. So if you think of a large language model or a foundation model that powers generative AI solutions, it's really just a giant calculator sitting somewhere. And if you don't put anything, if you don't attach it to a battery and to a screen, then it doesn't do anything, right? And it's the same for any other AI model. You'll just have a giant calculator sitting there. So you need to support it with software architecture, with GPUs, with computational infrastructure, with data validation. So like probably even more than 90% of the work when you're working on generative AI implementation is everything around the model. The model itself is probably the easiest part, and then all the data valuation and the architecting and development, that takes up way more time. So it's something just to be aware of. You can't just say, oh, let's make a GenAI project, because it actually entails everything that a normal project does with an additional step, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to add on top of that, I totally agree with you, Brandon. So the way we think about it, Donovan, is that if you think about machine learning and AI, it's been there for a while, and we spoke about that before. Now, what GenAI is allowing you to do is generate content. So if you think about use cases, you should think about where is that something where if you need to interact in a non-deterministic way, and if you need to generate content on the fly based on an input, usually with NLP, which is natural language processing, which is essentially you and I talking, what would be the technology? And that is where you should think about generative AI. It's not for everything, right? So I think it's important. Of course, there is machine learning technology for us in terms of SageMaker and others where you can use for other patterns. But if you think about where you use it, where you generate content in a non-deterministic way, I mean, think about generating text, multimodal text, audio, video, and so on and so forth, which is what is making the productivity a lot more important in the topic, right? So the way I would think about it is putting that into 3 themes. So one is, how do you enhance customer experience? So you as Donovan in a bank call someone, how long have you waited, like 1 hour on a call, trying to figure out for a simple question which you have, right? What if you had a system which automatically figured it out and then based on your question, answer that back to you, right? So that's one way of looking. How do I enhance your customer experience? The second one is more in terms of process improvements, right? So this is where, how can I take the existing process, which probably goes from one group to the other, where essentially you're looking for a certain piece of content and stitching it together. How can you actually bring generative AI to solve that problem? That's the second use case. And last one is more productivity, right? So the best I like, being a technologist, is that there are initiatives which Deloitte and AWS are working on where you're going to use GenAI to transform mainframe code into modern object-oriented programming technologies. And this is where, how do you convert existing patterns of code, which is probably monolith, and some of us have not even seen the card-based programming models, and how do you convert into object-oriented models, which are much more simpler and easier at the current day to manage and maintain, right? So that's another area. So 3 themes: productivity, operation, process optimizations, as well as the customer experience. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
I would comment also on the productivity. So I said earlier that like Gen AI isn't revolutionary in the way that we work, but it is in this way actually. So one of my favorite things about generative AI is that these coding assistants. I think it was Amazon Code Whisperer, and the name has changed recently, right?
Amazon Q Developer.
Yes, exactly. So I use it all the time, to be honest. I mean, it really cuts down the amount of time that I need to rewrite boilerplate code or convert code from one repository to the next. I cannot tell you how much of a difference it's made in my daily life. Being a coder, it's insane.
Totally. I'm glad. In fact, very recently, what we released is Amazon Q for apps, which essentially you can develop business applications within minutes, which used to take months before, right? So I'm totally excited for this technology. And we have many customers also talk about it. BT, for example, they gave us statistics of about 100,000 lines of code being done in a very short period of time, which roughly constituted about 12% of the larger initiative they were looking at. And this is going to change or make a difference in terms of how fast you can drive outcomes for your end customers. So it's huge. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. The other day, I'm thinking of a story as you guys are talking. One of my senior architects loves AWS, just wants to be in console all the days of his life. That's all he cares about. And he was sitting there on a lonely Saturday evening, and he needed an interface into one of the APIs he exposed in console. And he thought, oh man, who can I phone that's bored on Saturday evening that will write a quick, Java interface online for me to play with? And he thought, well, let me give this GenAI thing a quick whiz, and he opened up Bedrock Services and he just asked it to generate a piece of code. It took seconds. He double-clicked it on his desktop. It worked, and he could interface with his API. He phoned me Monday morning. He's like, "This thing is legit. It is real." So it's really cool to see how people are embracing it, playing with it. And I think one of the points that I really want to just summarize that we mentioned is that we're not really expecting our executives to be too worried about how it is orchestrated in the bottom. I think the tool and the technologies are there. The workflow is there. GenAI helps us orchestrate and piece that all together. And, what we really are expecting of them these days is to maybe continue to think about what is the future? What can I optimize? What experience can I give to my customers in a new, fresh way? How can I be more productive? How can we be more efficient in our day-to-day? And I think this is liberating for me as a business leader here as well, is to say, how do I embrace this? How do we do this better? And we, as Deloitte, have a clear agenda on generative AI, which is really, really exciting to see. And very quickly, we're providing features back to business that allowed us just to be able to quickly access policies, processes, controls internally. So yeah, really, really cool stuff. Question though, because we said, it's revolutionary to some degree, but at the same time, it's still AI. So data, I imagine, is still crucial in the discussion, right? And predominantly in most of what we see, and even as I talk to AWS, data is still key, making sure that we can access it, making sure that it's something useful, something we can understand, well-cataloged, whatever it may be. I mean, Do you see, maybe to Brandon, in some of the execution that you're doing, that data is still like a huge chunk of the time spent before we even get to the modeling piece?
Definitely. So even really large tech companies who are no stranger to data analysis, who are no stranger to software, still have, especially with the size, if a company is really big, they have lots of different processes. And it's not necessarily the case that all the people who are doing their jobs at that company have documented anything about what they do. Sometimes it just lives in their heads, right? And anytime that they hire somebody new, they have to explain, and the new people will learn by watching or by doing the same thing that their superiors have been doing, right? So when we talk about data, for me, it's about the good documentation of those processes and of the existing data that you need to support your software or your generative AI. If it's going to be accessing your knowledge repository or existing knowledge created by the business, it has to be written somewhere, and it should be written in a easy to follow format. And what generally happens is you just have papers and papers and papers that all are mostly about the same thing, but they have slightly different details, and that can make it really difficult to get good results. So almost all generative AI cases are going to be supported by a knowledge base at this point. But like more than 80% of the use cases are what we call RAG. It's retrieval augmented generative AI. And the retrieval augmented, that's basically like Google search on your documents, right? If I had to,
which is a common use case, right?
It's very, very common.
I've seen this RAG title and I'm like, what is that, right? But it means let's throw a bunch of documents unstructured at this thing, and it's able to turn it into a search, Google search type of.
Yes, and it's super powerful. It's really powerful with new like vector search, with hybrid search, what have you. But what's really important is to curate your data. This is important in machine learning, that you need to curate the data that you use to train the model, because otherwise you have terrible outputs. But also in a search system, if you have a lot of bad data or out-of-date data or poorly formatted data, that will trickle down into your outputs as well. So you can't just throw everything that the company has. It's really about getting some team on there and saying, oh, these are the criteria we should say allow a document to pass into the knowledge base, and these are the ones that we want to throw out. So you have this double-edged sword where you create the solution, you get a really nice knowledge repository, and all the people who are working at that company start to rethink about how they do their documentation processes and where they store that data and how to organize it. So it's a useful exercise.
I totally agree. Couldn't agree more. So if you think about, just trying to think about an analogy, right? But I think about generative AI, the new technology, acting as a compelling event for now companies to think about their data strategy, right? So data is critical. You cannot have a good generative AI solution without the right data. I think there is no running around it. And if you think about it, right? So with all the customers we've been working, the most successful customers till date who've actually got good on generative AI implementations are regulatory customers. Talk about large pharmacy companies, the banks, the public sector, for example. And partly because they have worked on regulation and compliance in order to address that. Data is critical. And most of them have a very good data strategy already, and they're now able to leverage that to build a lot more customer experience using generative AI. And that's an important fact. So it is very clear that data strategy is important. What we're also saying is for those who have actually not done this before, they're using this as a compelling event to get their data strategy right. And this is where we as AWS come out with all this tool set, right from SageMaker to our purpose-built databases, to our data lake using S3 and so on and so forth, where we make it easy for people to think about how do you get your data right, and then use the same platform to actually start building your application and improve more, right? So I think again, it's not about the volume of data. I want to emphasize that as well. It's the quality of the data.
For sure.
Right? In fact, today, and I was talking to one of our customers, Brandon, I think they have a large language model, and they had as little as 50 valid records, which they were able to use, fine-tune a model, and make it very relevant to their specific business process. So it is the right set of data, even if it is small, as long as you can use it and fine-tune your model, you get real outcomes for your end customers. So thinking data is the right thing. Making sure that you have the right data strategy is important, and using that to deliver outcome from a business point of view is the next thing in generative AI, Donovan.
I would agree actually about the fine-tuning thing. Just for our more technical listeners, usually in AI and ML, you need like thousands of examples or at least hundreds of examples for any medium-sized model to get good outputs. With these generative models and large language models, it's really nice. I mean, they're very good at one-shot or few-shot learning, even in context learning. So without any actual fine-tuning, you can just include it in the context prompt if it's a small use case or something, and still get 20-30% uplift on your accuracy. So it's really cool to see that after years in AI.
It is fascinating. It's fascinating what we can do. I mean, RAG is the other thing, right? Retrieval augmented generation, which we've talked about. And this is why AWS has been at the outset thinking about enterprises. I mean, probably the whole revolution started with a chat interface, and everyone started asking questions as to what the next big thing is. And then you used to get answers using the chat interface. But we look at how can we provide an outcome for enterprises, right? So we've thought about security at the outset. We've thought about how do you use your own private data? And this is where RAG is an important pattern. How can you fine-tune your own model? So this is where we allow fine-tuning your model with minimal set of data and make it your own so that you don't fear of losing your proprietary data and your business IP to someone else, which is one of the biggest risks which I hear from the IT as well as the C-suite, asking as to how can I be trusting a model? How can I be sure that my data doesn't reach someone else? Right. How can I create guardrails, right? So along with data, I mean, if you will, there would be a lot of other topics which would come. This is something which we as consultants should actually talk to our customers around.
I was going to ask that exact question earlier is, let's say I'm an executive, customer experience is a theme, which is obvious for GenAI, the interface with my customers through chatbots, wanting to now employ generative AI models to support how I interact with my clients. Like, if I'm on the more risk-averse side and I'm going, well, I've heard the horror stories about hallucinations. Can you talk through that maybe? Like, is it a data issue? Is it a model issue? Like, how do we combat that? Should we be concerned? Should we be worried? Are things not mature enough yet for us to be using them at that level?
Yes. So I'm going to start this off by saying, so people hallucinate too, actually. So if you if you go into any consulting meeting and you ask somebody a question, if they don't know the answer, they might make something up based on what they already know. And these models do exactly the same thing. So based on their training data, they might try to answer because that's what they've been trained to do.
But they have to answer.
And they have to
where
answer.
People don't have to.
Unless you instruct them not to, right? So it's really important to do lots of validation, lots of evaluation. So anytime that you have output in a system where you expect some answer, you need to document that and then test what the model has output and then whether it vibes with your expected outputs. There was one case where I think it was Air Canada or some airline in North America implemented a chatbot, right? So they had a chatbot on their website, and they told it, they gave it a RAG system, which was based on their documentation, internal policies, that kind of stuff. And a customer was asking, can I get a refund for this ticket because of XYZ? Under their policies, he wouldn't have gotten a refund, but the chatbot hallucinated, and it didn't have access to all of the context that was necessary to answer the question. And it said, yeah, we can give you a refund. It's no problem. And the company tried not to give it to him. They went to court, and they ended up having to pay because whatever the chatbot came up with was legally binding. So in that case, it's a case of, they probably put a large language model there. They were like, great, we have a chatbot, when without sufficient levels of validation. Same thing with any other system. If you expect some structured outputs, then you have to test what the structured outputs are. And large language models are really bad at giving the same answer every time. It's still an ongoing area of research how to make it output data in a deterministic way. So even with the same inputs, I might give it the same sentence a couple times and it gives me two different answers. And it's because of the way that the math works inside of the model that you can't get the same answer every time. So it's just something to be aware of. But in most cases, you can control for it. You can make it less than 1% of the time, or depending on the requirements of your solution, you just got to test and make sure that it's okay.
So that was rather that sort of particular use case is rather an exception rather than the norm. So if you're employing the correct guardrails, and you were chatting through this earlier, we can curb for those sorts of hallucinations, right?
Yeah. So as a typical software developer, right, so there's a term. This is not a bug, it's a feature, right? So this is a true definition of that, right? Because it's important to understand why it is that way. If you realistically think about it, it's about learning patterns, learning with the data which you've fed to the model, and eventually the model makes a call as to, okay, this is what I would been fed and this is what I would do. So most of the models today, right, are fed with large data which may or may not include some of the topics which you're talking about, right? So of course, it's got its mechanism of how to non-deterministically generate a content based on that, right? So now this is where we as AWS play an important role, right? So we always think about enterprises. Now, it is fun while you're having just an internet-based chat and then talking about some fun things. Even if you get a wrong answer, it's perfectly fine, but it's not acceptable for enterprises, right? So this is where I think it's important for us to think about what should you do to ensure that you're delivering a reliable, trustworthy end system which will help customers get the right outcome. So this is where a bit of architecture and work needs to be done. And as AWS, we provide what is called as guardrails. And very recently, we announced the fact that we can now create guardrails. We can suppress hallucination by about 75%. But again, I wouldn't say it's going to be 100% because the whole thing about model is to generate content. And it generates content based on the data, what it has. And if it is not the right answer, we would say it's hallucinating because it's actually giving something which what it thinks is right, which I totally agree, even humans do, right? So sometimes you've seen people give something even if they don't know the answer, right? So it's
yeah, well, you know, my wife would argue the point even without knowing the fact. Anyway, let's not go down that road.
Would it be okay if I make one comment about hallucinations? So there's actually two types, and one of them is like basically if you don't give any context to the model and you ask a question. So there's benchmarking papers that come out usually with like commercially available models. So they say, okay, GPT-4, we've decreased the amount of hallucination by 25%, and they usually measure this like per sector. So they'll say on banking questions it hallucinates at this rate, on financial services it's at this rate, in biology it's this rate. But it's different. That type of hallucination is different from the type of hallucination in RAG systems where you actually give the context and you say, don't pay attention to anything you know or anything outside of what I give you. Here's the context. Now make an assessment or give me some output. And in those cases, of course, the rate of hallucination is significantly lower. Like it's almost none for some of the largest models. So those are much easier to control than an open-ended question sort of interaction.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how enterprises are using today, and that's a great point, that's the way we think about it as well, is that you pick up model, there are ways of making it very contextual for yourself, right? So the first thing is just prompt engineering, right? So just give the right context and get the right data out, right? So it is very effective, least from a cost point of view, the least when you're creating a system. But then you can fine tune your models, right? So give your specific data to the model and then make the model be more relevant to the kind of domain you're working on, right? So it could be just 50 lines of data from a travel industry would actually give you a profile information of certain kind of buyers, and then it gives itineraries which are very related to that. The next level is actually taking that further and making it very specific to your context, right? So this is where you can amend and make a specific LLM which are very private to you. And this is where you'll have more features and flexibilities of making additional changes to your model. And the most expensive one, which again we allow, is the likes of Bloomberg, where you actually create your own model, which is financial large language model, which is purpose-built for your industry and domain, right? So where it wouldn't hallucinate on other data from other industries, and it'll be very more specific. So there are ways of addressing it. It's just that we are so early in this journey, Donovan, that a lot of people probably use the wrong solution for wrong problems, and we are seeing. So this is where a little more is needed from a training point of view.
That's what's helpful for the C-suite to know. Full circle.
Yeah. I wanted to ask this question as well. In terms of accessibility, I mean, we talk about models, it sounds very data sciencey, it sounds pretty distant, I think, from non-technical folk. Like, how easy is it to go in and just pick an LLM and train it on a small data set. You said it's a small subset, doesn't need to be a large subset of data. How easy and accessible is that? How much coding ability do I need to have? Are we talking thousands, tens of thousands of lines of code? Like, what does that look like?
It depends what you want to do with it. So if you just want to have a chat buddy on your laptop, then effectively no coding experience is required. There's plenty of like low code solutions. Even on AWS, I guess Bedrock has some interfaces where you can just go in and start typing things immediately, and there's a drop-down menu for the models, so that's super easy. If you're looking for something slightly more complicated, like it needs to have access to the internet, or it needs to be able to look at my schedule or my email or something, then you're talking about probably, 2,000 to 4,000 lines of code.
Okay, so
3 months implementation, something like that, with a team of 2 people or something. I mean, even the simple ones, like in order to make it, you can throw something together in 2 days. You can throw anything together in 2 days, but you won't have any validation. It'll be hard to scale it. It'll be hard to ensure security. So it really takes weeks to build out something that's really useful in an enterprise.
But relatively low investment in terms of being able to play and test.
Yeah, Donovan, I was planning to do a house extension. I didn't know the council rules and what have you, so they have a 300 or 400 page document. All I did was took that document, used that as the data source, and the 33 models within AWS, just picked one which converts text to question and answers. Just link that and ask very specific questions. I had my answers. I didn't have to really skim through all the story. All I'm saying is that if you have a requirement which is as simple as that, it's pretty easy, probably 5-10 minutes work. It's just the time needed to upload the document. But when you think about enterprise-grade applications, I think it's a new mental model of how you think, right? So in the past, you think about how do you write code, how do you validate that code, and eventually how do you build that system. If you think about applications with GenAI, it's not so much of code. It's more how do you train the data, how do you pick the right model. So that's your effort, and not necessarily what does it take to actually build it. And once you do it, it's about are you getting the right outcomes, and can you actually expose it with the right APIs for someone else to use? And that's the shift. And of course, you have to continuously think about different patterns, provide more data, and make sure that your model is becoming more relevant as your business grows. And that's the only effort I would think about. So like Brandon was mentioning, it depends, but actually to get started, the boundary to enter it is very low cost.
Great. So I recently was in one of your pitches with your data strategists, and they presented a really cool case. I'm almost sure a public reference for an airline in the Nordics. The use case around generative AI was training models on policies and procedures for ground control. And if I remember vaguely, the pilot lands the plane, and he needs to wait for some sort of connection or communication to ground control for someone to instruct him on what to do, what to park, how to move. And now, as he lands, he's waiting 10, 15 minutes. He's able to automatically interface with this generative AI model, which is instructing him what to do based on policies and procedures, saving time, enhanced customer experience, etc., which was such a cool case. And I love hearing stuff like this over and above just, throwing a document or an image and trying to do something really mundane. Do you hear of other exciting use cases? Maybe you want to share one or two with the listeners?
We talk a lot about text generation models because those are the most salient. They're the easiest to access. We are all, talking to each other and using language, and so the text models are usually what we talk about. And the mundane things are, of course, they're what we spend most of our time with. So even though they're mundane, they're super, super useful. So I love them. But outside of that realm, I mean, generative AI also encompasses like 3-dimensional protein modeling. So sequencing genes and how those produce proteins and how those proteins fold on each other and how those proteins would interact with different biological systems in the body, whether they would lead to adverse effects, all this kinds of stuff. I mean, even that's under the purview of generative AI, right? So, I don't want to talk for too long. I'll give you, so you get the next example, but that's probably my favorite outside of the realm of like mundane things.
Passionate, perhaps?
Yeah.
It's very passionate. I mean, the art of possible is immense, Donovan. I think every time I speak to customers, I just get so excited. Airline example is a classic case of optimizing the process, right? So what took a lot of individual things, which could be potentially a manual error, is now automated. And this now makes life so simple, right? So how do we optimize the process is always the thought process. So that's a classic example. I want to give a couple of more examples, right? So let's start off with customer experiences. I love the story of what we are doing with Intuit, right? So Intuit has, you all might know TurboTax.
Of course.
Yeah.
Generative OS is something which they've built in a platform called Assist. So what Intuit is doing is that helping every individual personalize their tax returns. We all know that we all look at, what's my tax band? And then, am I actually missing something? Have I not declared something? And this is the typical question we always ask ourselves. I mean, am I missing something? Will the tax man actually come hunting to me because I haven't done something right? Now, what if...
And can I get more money out of the tax?
Perfect.
That's kind of what it is.
Yeah. What if you had a mechanism where you upload your tax information and you get checklists based on all the policies, very specific to you, and how can you leverage that with a checklist and then file your returns and be very comfortable and confident that A, you've got all the benefits, right? Essentially, you got every tax returns what you should, but also be confident that you actually declared everything what you should because the system prompts you to do that, right? So this is a very important case where you can think about how it can help you from a customer experience point of view. Booking.com is another thing which I love because and it's just not in Booking.com. I've seen many other travel sites where you can be now very specific. I want to go for a wedding in South Africa for summer, right? For example, I can be as specific as that. It not only helps you actually put the right itinerary, but also recommend what could be the right dress for you because me being in the UK, I don't want to go with a heavy coat and then realize that I'll be sweating in the forests of South Africa, right? So all of this, all coming together from a customer experience makes your life a lot more simpler, right? So that's the other use case from a customer experience perspective. Productivity we've talked about. I think the advantage of developers now not wanting to do the most mundane job and focus on actually thinking about business logic is something which I love the most. And then process-wise, you spoke about one, pharmaceuticals. Amazon Pharmacy uses generative AI, where it scans all the prescriptions, makes sure that the right prescription is provided to the right end users, automates all of those things, double checks, all the conformance from a policy point of view is done, everything automated, so that you can actually deliver the medicines to the end user as quickly as you can, right? So if you think about process optimization, there are so many use cases. So many, but I could speak on this for days.
We probably could. Well, yeah, these are great cases. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody, for watching this week. We'll see you next week on The Generative Edge. And remember, generate responsibly.